Hey there, Gators, and welcome back for another lecture review. This topic is on social psychology. As always, you'll have our student learning outcomes in the beginning, so you'll be able to see all of the different things we're going to talk about. And we'll start with a definition. So what is social psychology? I know many of you have probably had experience with sociology, and this is a question people ask a lot then. What's the difference between sociology and psychology? Well, social psychology kind of helps to bridge this gap between the societal level and individual level analysis. So with social psychology, it's almost like this bridge between sociology and psychology. What we're looking at with social psych is how people affect one another's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So kind of the mere presence of other people, the power of the situation that you find yourself in, how does this impact the individual self? Some of these topics are intrapersonal, so they deal with the individual. That's things like emotions and the self, self-cognition. Other topics that we'll talk about are interpersonal. So these are things that really pertain to dyads or to groups. So intrapersonal is the self, interpersonal is between individuals. So interpersonal topics include things like prejudice, group processes, and relationships. So a big kind of controversy within psychology is the situational and dispositional influences. So, is behavior then a product of the situation, or is it a product of the person? So we have different kind of schemes of thought on this idea. Situationism thinks that it's part of the environment. Dispositionism thinks it's internal factors, one's disposition. And we have a whole field of psychology that's devoted to kind of looking at these differences. So this social personality psychology is a field of psychology then trying to understand internal and situational factors, so the context and the person, and how they interact with each other. And this interaction can be really complex. So if you're really interested in personality psych, social psych, you can do kind of this mix of this social personality psych. So a big error that we often make that's important to start with is the fundamental attribution error. This is something that all of us make. We tend to overemphasize internal factors, so those dispositional elements, and underemphasize the situational factors when we understand the behavior of other people. So if you imagine somebody cutting you off in traffic, typically we'll overestimate that it's something about them, their disposition, so we'll just say, you're a jerk. And then we underemphasize those situational factors. So we don't think about the fact that they could be late to pick their kid up from daycare, or they could be late to work, or they could have to go to the bathroom really bad, so they're speeding. We don't think about those things, that it might be a situation. We just normally go right to, it's a disposition. It's who this person is. So that's the fundamental attribution error. We do this a lot within individualistic cultures especially. So we do this in part because of this actor-observer bias. So we can attribute others' behavior to internal factors, attribute our own behavior to situations. And a lot of that is because we have knowledge about our own situations, but all we have from other people is what we can see. We don't have knowledge on their situation. So we just kind of see what they do, and we assume then that it's part of them. The self-serving bias is something that helps us, so it allows us to see ourselves in a good light, to keep our self-esteem. So when something happens that's good, we get a positive outcome, maybe you get an A on a test, we think this is due to the self. So I got an A on my test because I'm really smart and I tried really hard. If we get a negative outcome, so maybe we get an F on a test, then we think that's for external reasons. So I just didn't have enough time to study this week, it was a really hard week, it was something about my situation, it's not myself. So being able to kind of have this self-serving bias helps us to preserve our self-esteem. We've got a lovely comic here from Peanuts kind of about this actor-observer bias. We also have attributions. So a part of what we're doing when we try to understand the behavior of other people is making an attribution. So with our attributions, we have several components. The locus of control is this within one's control? Is it internal, or is it something out in the environment, external? Stability, is this going to happen all the time, or is it unstable? Does it only happen sometimes? And then controllability, how much control does the person have over it? Is it controllable or uncontrollable? So if you win a game, maybe you're doing some wrestling here, some boxing, and you win that match, then we often think this is due to something about the self, so the person's really great at the sport, that it's going to happen all the time, it's stable, and that it was within their control. So that's the attributions that we'll often make for victory. For loss, we'll make attributions that rely more on its external, so it was a bad week, it wasn't a good training week, the other person just caught me off guard, so it's some kind of external reason. It's unstable, so it's unlikely to happen again that I'm going to lose, and there were just situations out of my control that made me lose. So then we kind of make these attributions that serve the self, that allow us to maintain self-esteem, maintain positive feelings, as well as kind of try to preserve those feelings that we're a worthy person who's going to do well in the future. Another way that we kind of preserve this worldview is through the just world hypothesis. So with this, we have this tendency to believe that people get the outcomes they deserve. So we think good things happen to good people. If you're a good person, then you're going to have good outcomes. It allows us to think that if I'm just a good person, the world is predictable and I have some level of control over the world. But unfortunately, this just world hypothesis doesn't always hold true. So if you have thoughts like the poor are lazy and just don't want to work, it can ignore all of those situational factors. So it's not just disposition, it's not just laziness, personal factors. There's also a lot of societal factors that come into play. But this belief there that in this just world hypothesis allows us to kind of blame the victim rather than trying to understand the situation that the victim is nested within. Self-presentation are really important things. So this is kind of how we present ourselves to the world. So we all have social roles. These are behaviors that are given to us in a certain situation. So we have gender roles is a good one. So this is something that each of us has kind of to follow, to understand, is that we have certain roles according to our gender that we are supposed to do in society. So we have certain roles, certain behaviors that are expected of us. Our social norms are these expectations for the behaviors that we'll do. We'll look at some examples of them. But the roles are more like, how does a female act? How does a college student act? How does a mother act? So you have all of these roles that you play. The social norms are more like little unwritten rules, which we'll talk some more about those. And then scripts are this knowledge that we possess that tell us exactly what we're going to have experienced in certain situations. So if I go to the airport, I have a script that tells me what's supposed to happen in each step. So I walk in, I obtain my boarding pass, I walk through security, I take off my shoes, I progress through the machines that do the x-rays. So it's a specific script as to everything that's going to happen. So all of these things help us to dictate how we act in social situations and how we present ourselves to others. As promised, here's some examples of social norms. So typically we sit like the woman here who's got her knees together. We don't typically sit as females with our legs spread way apart. So that's not that it's a rule or a law that we can't sit with our legs spread far apart. We are certainly welcome to do that. We just don't typically do it in society. We also see that if you're in a urinal, if you're in a restroom, that many times two people, if the urinal's full or urinal's empty, there's many spaces available, people don't normally stand side by side and then they don't stare at each other. So, you're welcome to stand side by side. It's no law against it, but we just typically don't do that behavior. We also typically stare at the door in an elevator. We don't stare in the corner, as this person's doing here. We don't stand right next to somebody in their personal space. All of those are social norms. Then we've got this comic here kind of playing on the idea of social norms. So he's in a subway and he says, "Goodbye, everybody," and it's this new in town, kind of saying that we don't do that when we get off the subway. We don't say goodbye, goodbye, but he doesn't know that. He doesn't have that social norm that's understood. So you can probably think of many types of social norms, things that are not rules, not laws, but we just follow them in society. So an experiment that's really famous, you may have heard of, was kind of demonstrated, or was kind of put on to demonstrate these roles then that we take on and we play, and kind of the scripts and norms that we possess. So what Zimbardo did for this experiment was take in healthy volunteers. So these were all male college students. They were all healthy. They were randomly assigned then to be a prisoner or a guard. So he just said, A, B, and C, you're prisoners, D, E, and F, you're guards. Random assignment. So he just wanted to see if he set up a mock prison, randomly assigned healthy guys to be prisoners or guards, how would they subscribe to that role? So I definitely would suggest that you, kind of engage in this idea a little bit more. There's many videos on this. There's movies on this, Hollywood movies. Just kind of this idea of what's going to happen. And it's so fascinating to me what really did happen here. So they wanted to run this experiment for 2 weeks, but they only could run it for 6 days because the behavior of these men deteriorated so rapidly. So we had people engaging in physical types of punishment, people breaking down psychologically, having panic attacks, wanting to escape, planning a riot. I mean, they subscribed to their roles pretty much right off the bat. So the prisoners became prisoners, the guards became guards, and even though they were really just healthy college students, they started to act like that prison was a real, true prison. So it's super fascinating. I think if you want to do some more studies into that. I think you'll find it's a really fascinating topic and truly shows how much we assign or ascribe to those roles that are assigned to us. So Zimbardo really asked the question from this work then, are people bad apples or are they in bad barrels? So these guys, they seem pretty healthy, pretty good on the outset. So what happened then? We put them in a bad situation and then they ascribe to that bad situation. So it really gave us this interesting idea, is it the person or is it the situation? Some attitudes information. So we'll talk here about attitudes. We all have attitudes towards different things. I've got here a picture of Brussels sprouts. So you can evaluate this object. You can evaluate them favorably or unfavorably. And these attitudes that you might have towards Brussels sprouts can have different components. So you might have an emotional or affective attitude, like, ooh, gross, or yummy. You might have a behavioral attitude, so you might eat them or not eat them. And then you might have cognitions or thoughts. So Brussels sprouts are a healthy vegetable, or Brussels sprouts smell like used gym socks. Those are thought processes that you might have. So that attitude about Brussels sprouts then is going to kind of dictate whether or not you engage with Brussels sprouts. So just an activity about attitudes, just kind of think through these. You might write them down. So world hunger is a serious problem. Our country needs to address the growing number of homeless. So for this, you're just saying yes or no, maybe writing down yes or no. The right to vote is one of the most valuable rights of our citizens. And finally, our government should spend less money on nukes and more on helping their citizens. So you've got your yes and your no. So the yes or no is not really the important part. What's important is this next piece. So do you personally do anything to lessen hunger? Do you personally do anything to help the homeless? Did you vote in the last election? And do you convey your feelings at all to the government? So as you can see here, you're asked to give an attitude about something, an attitude about hunger, an attitude about the homeless, and then asked whether or not you actually do anything in alignment with that attitude. So for some of you, if you believe world hunger is not a serious problem, and then you don't do anything about it, you're not going to feel badly there. So that doesn't really cause any feelings of discomfort. But if you do believe world hunger is a bad problem, and you say you don't do anything about it, then that might make you feel a little bit off. It might give you that feeling that things are not 100% right. We call that feeling cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is this discomfort that you can feel because you're holding two or more inconsistent attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, or cognitions. So you're holding these attitudes. So world hunger is a problem. I don't do anything to help world hunger. So those are opposite. If you have both of those at the same time, they make you feel badly. So what we can do then to reduce cognitive dissonance is to kind of bring our cognitions, attitudes, and behaviors in line. So we can do this many ways. We can change our behavior. So then I can say, okay, I think world hunger is a problem. I'm not doing anything for world hunger, so tomorrow I'm going to volunteer for world hunger. So now I've changed my behavior. I can change my cognitions. So I can just kind of say, I don't think that hunger is a really big problem. I can change my thoughts. Or I can add a new cognition. So other people are doing more for hunger. Or maybe I can think more about doing it in the future. So it's adding some other thought that makes us feel better. This is another example here. So if you're going to a restaurant while you're dieting, you might plan to order a salad. So you're on this diet, you're going to order your salad. But then when the wait staff comes, this is what you actually order. So a giant hamburger. So this is going to lead you to have two different thoughts or two different behaviors. I need to lose weight, I'm on a diet, and I ordered a massive, massive cheeseburger. So these don't really line up. They don't really mesh well together. So what you might do instead is rationalize it. So I really needed all that protein, or I've been doing so well on my diet that I earned it. So you kind of make this work for yourself somehow. You rationalize, and that reduces that feeling of dissonance then. You feel better. So we can also see cognitive dissonance come into play when we join groups. So if we have a difficult initiation, something that's really, really difficult, to kind of get into this group, something that's really hard, it takes you a long time, it's a lot of effort, then we end up actually liking that group more because we would kind of have those feelings of, I'm a smart person, I'm a good person, and I just put in tons and tons of effort to get into this group. So it kind of makes us think, we must love this group. Otherwise, why would we put forth so much effort? I mean, we're smart people, so why would we be hazed? We're not someone who gets hazed. We're smart, we're intelligent, we're, we're good, and so we shouldn't have that experience. So then we have to mesh those feelings together, and we say, I really just went through that horrible experience because I love this group. I love it. So if it's really, really hard to get into a group, we end up feeling more like we like that group, like it's a group that matters to us. So that brings us into persuasion. With persuasion, it's this process of changing our attitudes. So this can happen in multiple ways. So we can see this Yale attitude change approach kind of explains this ways that these can happen. So we look at the features of the source. So is the speaker credible? Is the speaker attractive? We look at the message they're providing for us, as well as the characteristics of the audience that's designed to get that message. There's many techniques that we can use to change attitudes. So a really famous one is this foot in the door technique. So someone who's trying to get you to modify your attitude or modify your behavior might ask you for something really small and then come back and ask you later for another favor. So they might say, hey, could you put this yard sign in your yard that says we need to recycle more? And you'll say, okay. And then you put the yard sign in your yard, and then they come back a week later and say, can you donate some money to this campaign? We see you have the yard sign. Can you give us some money to establish recycling? You've already agreed to the smaller task, so you might go ahead and just agree to the bigger one as well. So that's foot in the door. This elaboration likelihood model, this kind of goes along with this messages. So we have this persuasive message, so it could be anything, like you need to recycle. We have a central route, and then we have a peripheral route. Our central route is best when the audience is really motivated, when they're analytical, when they spend time thinking about the message. So they're putting in this high effortful processing. And this persuasion then is likely to lead to a lasting change. So for the central route, you want to give people real facts about recycling, tell them what really happens with recycling, explain the process, explain the amount of recycled materials that don't go into a landfill. You want to give them all that really great info. For the peripheral route, the audience is just kind of sitting there. They're not really motivated. They don't want to think about it that much. So you want to give them then information that's just kind of low level. So it's not really the message that matters. It might be more things like celebrity or a beautiful person, someone who's attractive, things like that. Some outside characteristics, not really high level thought. But this often leads to a temporary change in attitude. So people might recycle, the can that they're drinking currently, but then it's really not going to lead them to recycle throughout their lifespan. So we see a lot of examples, though, of this kind of focus on celebrity within our product placement. So here's some examples here. We can see, Doritos, Coca-Cola cups, FedEx, a certain type of computer. All of these examples being provided is just ways that products are infused into our lives, kind of thinking that we will then want to eat those products or consume those products. Conformity is another big issue that is studied within social psych. Conformity, we really started looking at conformity with Ash's work. So what Ash did was he brought in participants. So many of them in a group were Confederates, and he brought in one real participant. So he'd ask them then to match lines. So you can see at the bottom of this slide we have an X, and then we have A, B, and C. So he'd ask the participants to go ahead and tell him which line matched up with X. This is not a difficult task, but he had all of the Confederates, so almost the entire group, except for that one real subject, give the wrong answer. And he saw what happened. So he found that 76% of his participants would conform at least once to the wrong answer. So the wrong answer might be, X is B. So we can see pretty readily that B is not lined up with X. They're not the same length, but everyone in the whole group would say B, 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 B. And you get to that one real participant, and the participant would just go, B? They would conform, even though they knew it was wrong. So conformity then is that behavior to go along with a group. It's really important about the size of the majority. If one person was a dissenter and they, actually said, well, I think it's actually C, then the real participant didn't conform. So presence of a dissenter helped to reduce conformity. And then if the vote was private, it helped to reduce conformity. So it didn't have to be public, it could be private. That reduced that tendency to conform. So it really seems to be something about giving your answer that's different from everyone else right in front of everyone else. We don't want to rock the boat. There's also motivations to conform that are based in normative and informational social influence. So sometimes we just want to think others are right. Other times we think they have more information than we do ourselves. Milgram's experiment was a really famous and important one within social psych. This is another one that I would urge you to spend some time kind of, looking at, investigating a little bit more. We've got Hollywood movies about Milgram as well. So it's a really, really interesting experiment. What he wanted to understand was obedience, which is a little different than conformity. Conformity, you're just kind of motivated to agree with the group. Obedience, you're more motivated to comply with the demand of an authority figure. So he had individuals come in and he quote-unquote randomly assigned them to teacher or learner, but he didn't really randomly assign. So the learner was always a confederate. They were part of it. So the real participant was always the teacher. And what he would ask teachers to do then is to provide the learner with some mild shock, and that would keep getting higher and higher in voltage as the answers were wrong. So he'd say, teacher, you need to teach the learner something. If the learner messes up, you need to give him a shock, and that shock needs to keep increasing over time. So what he thought was happening, or what the teacher thought was happening, was that they were providing shock. There was no actual shock provided in this experiment. So the only shock that was real was a little one that teachers got right at the onset so that they could feel the shock. And they said, this is what the learner's going to feel, and it's just going to get more intense from there. The learner did not actually experience shock, but the teacher thought they were giving them shocks. So they would just keep doing this and doing this. What Milgram initially thought was that people would shock up to a certain level and then would stop. They would say, this is too much. So they would ask a question, the learner would respond incorrectly, the teacher would shock them. And as this kept going on, the teacher would hear things from the learner like, oh, my heart, I have a heart condition. I can't breathe, I need to stop, let me out. So the learner would start protesting on a certain schedule. They'd keep saying, let me out, and the teacher was told to just keep shocking, just keep shocking. And so what they thought would happen, what Milgram and all of his peers thought would happen, is that people would get to a certain level and then just say, you know what, I'm not shocking this guy anymore. But that's not what happened. So people kept shocking. So 65% of the individuals in the study shocked all the way up to the maximum when told to do so. So it wasn't saying that they did it joyfully. Many of these teachers would turn around, look at the guy behind them in the white lab coat and say, you know, who's going to take responsibility if this guy gets hurt? I don't want to keep shocking them. This isn't what I want to do. And the guy in the lab coat, the one who's the authority figure, would say, the experiment requires that you continue. You must continue. So then the teacher would just keep going. They might have protested, they might have said no, but in most of the cases, then 65%, people just kept going. They kept shocking that learner up to the point where the learner was non-responsive, where it really might have been that they killed somebody. And so it's an incredibly difficult thing to realize, is that we have the capacity to do this. We have the capacity to hurt other people, to keep going against our conscience, just in terms of obeying people, of obeying an authority figure. So it's kind of a dark side of human nature to have this obedience, but it's important to understand, how this occurs and in what context it occurs. And so that's why I would definitely suggest kind of looking more into Milgram's work. Groupthink is something that kind of goes along with this idea of conformity and obedience, but with this, it's not really being told to. We just kind of have the tendency to modify our opinions to align with those of the group. This is especially so if the group is cohesive, nobody wants to rock the boat. If the group is isolated, the leader is a directive person. We saw this in the Cuban Missile Crisis. People were, these governments were really isolated, they were cohesive, these government groups, and they were trying to figure things out, but they weren't seeking the things that we know that help people make good decisions. So to make better decisions, we really need to get outside opinions, we need to vote in private, get more research, and then really spend some time weighing costs and benefits. So there's ways to get against this kind of groupthink idea, but we just need to make sure we're not isolated and kind of all falling in with the same opinion. Spend some time kind of researching and understanding things. Our social facilitation and social loafing are kind of opposites of each other. So social facilitation, we actually perform better when someone's watching us. So these are things that are easy or that we're really skilled at. So you might have a basketball team that doesn't do so hot when they're just practicing, but when you put them in front of an audience, they're doing amazing. So they're being watched, they're doing better. The social interaction is facilitating their performance. Social loafing is a little different. So with this, we see people actually exert less effort when they're with a group. So if you put them in, group work versus individual work, they'll just say, you know what, I'll let my group pick up the slack, and I'm not going to do anything. That's social loafing. This is not something we see across all cultures, though. So in individualistic cultures, we really see social loafing. So you put someone in a group, and they're like, I'll let y'all do it. In more collectivist cultures, people work harder in a group so as not to let their group down. So we don't see social loafing. We see more of a social facilitation. So it's really fascinating. There's definitely cultural differences here. This chart just gives you kind of a information about the types of social influences that we've discussed and gives a brief definition there. So it's a nice kind of handy chart. And that brings us into prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice and discrimination is one of our last big topics. So with prejudice, this is kind of a negative attitude. So it's that attitudinal component based solely on someone's membership in a certain group. So it can be things like gender, sexual orientation. Oftentimes it begins in a stereotype, so kind of this negative belief about people. And then discrimination is when we act out those attitudes. So we've got those prejudicial attitudes and then they're acted out in some form. So this kind of chart will give us information about stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, so you can kind of read their function, how they're related. But prejudice or discrimination can take on many names. So if it's due to someone's racial or ethnic group, we call that racism. Some of these attitudes are explicit, so they're specifically said, and others are implicit, so they just come from living within a certain culture. So something like men should be in the workforce and women should be at home. That is a more sexist kind of viewpoint because it's kind of limiting the roles of men and women, but it's something we get from our culture. So even if we don't believe it explicitly, we might have an implicit kind of feeling that that should be the way it is because we've been raised within our specific culture. So some things we say and we believe and we're conscious, those are explicit attitudes. Others are implicit, they come from living in a certain culture. So we've got racism, sexism is based on sex, ageism is based on age, often towards older individuals. And then sexual orientation, bias against individuals, is called homophobia. The research actually suggests that people who have this extreme homophobia are the ones who are more sexually aroused, oftentimes the ones who are more sexually aroused by homosexual acts. So it's kind of fascinating that it might be this reaction to one's own feelings of arousal. This is a way that we look at implicit attitudes. So I've linked down in here this implicit association test, and what it does is have you kind of base on reaction time, try and get at these implicit attitudes that you may hold from being raised in your certain culture. So it's got a lot of different discrimination kind of tests in there that you can look at, things for racism, sexism, tons of interesting things that you can kind of explore and see your own implicit biases. So it's definitely a good way to kind of spend some time looking at that. Prejudice and discrimination, we think these really persist due to social learning, so learning from other people, as well as conforming to norms. And the self-fulfilling prophecy is another major issue here. So with this, we hold these stereotypes about a person. So we may say women are bad at math. Then we tend to treat the person according to our expectations. So, here's a math test, you're not going to do that well, female. This treatment can then influence the person to act according to our expectations. So they might just say, well, might as well not even bother on this math test because I'm not going to do well anyway. And then that confirms our beliefs. So then when the female does poorly on the math test, we say, oh, women are terrible at math anyway. So it's this cycle where we have actions towards someone that influences, based on our beliefs of them, that influence their own beliefs, their own actions, and then eventually kind of support then our negative beliefs. So this self-fulfilling prophecy can kind of be a cycle that, really contributes to this, prejudice and discrimination in society. Another big thing that contributes to prejudice and discrimination are in and out groups. We all have in-groups, so you might have an in-group of basketball players that you're a part of, or line dancers, or painters. We all belong to groups. This helps us with our identity, with our self-esteem, but the problem is that we have out-groups. We don't belong to those. We can't belong to every group, so that's not necessarily an issue itself, but the problems are when we get into these biases. So we have preference for those groups that we belong in, preference for our group of cloggers. And this, then we don't have preference for the group of slow dancers. We are not a part of that group. So this can result in us then scapegoating them. So we blame the slow dancers when we lose money for our clogging club. So we can scapegoat an organization, a group of people, someone who's our out group when our in group is frustrated. So it can lead to this out group, in group bias, which is a problem. These are some comics kind of explaining this in-group, out-group bias, of people kind of seeing their own viewpoint, not really being able to see the viewpoint of others. And that brings us into aggression. So we're talking a little bit about scapegoating and frustration. Aggression is when we really want to cause harm or pain to somebody. Hostile aggression especially is wanting to cause that pain. But instrumental aggression is more that you're doing it just because you need to achieve a goal. So maybe you kick somebody in the kneecap, but you're only doing it because you're on the basketball field and you're trying to play basketball, on your court, trying to play, and you just accidentally knee them while you're trying to get past them to score. That's different from then intentionally kicking somebody in the kneecap because you want them to have pain. So the hostile and instrumental difference is pretty big. Why aggression exists, we think this could be evolutionary, so needing to meet your goals, you might have to get somebody out of your way to meet your goals, as well as this idea that we get frustrated or we get aggressive when we get frustrated. So if someone gets in our way, doesn't let us do what we need to do, doesn't let us achieve our goals, then we may show more frustration towards that individual, more aggression. Bullying is something that's become a bigger problem, or at least we're spending more and more effort towards understanding bullying. This can be kind of this negative treatment of another person. It can be physical, verbal, psychological. It has many parties. So we've got the bully and the victim. Sometimes the bully is a victim of someone else. So there's not always a clear-cut distinction. And we've got those other individuals who witness it, though. So this can be negative for everyone involved. And another big area of research where we're trying to do more and more work is on cyberbullying. With cyberbullying, this is typically something that's less obvious. So it can be things like spreading rumors, but we know that those effects are also just as harmful, and I think if not more harmful than traditional bullying. Because at least with traditional bullying, if someone's bullying you on the schoolyard, when you go home, you get away from them. With cyberbullying, people can reach you day and night on your cell phone, your computer. So it's bullying that can occur with really no end. So I think that we're going to have a lot more research about these harmful effects of cyberbullying as time goes on. So we've got just a couple more little topics. The bystander effect is something that's really important to understand. So this is something that you can use if you ever find yourself needing to call 911 or if you ever witness an event that you're not sure of what to do. So in 1964, this woman, Kitty Genovese, was coming home from work. She was attacked near her apartment, and then she was attacked again as she went inside to try to get into her apartment. So her attacker, stabbed her and attacked her, and she was screaming for help during this time. And the story behind this was that many people heard, lots of witnesses, but nobody did anything. So there is some conflicting evidence that maybe some people were doing something. There's some documentaries based on this idea, but at least, at the time there was this whole story kind of published on how Kitty was attacked. Nobody came to help, and it really helped us to understand what we now call the bystander effect. So witnesses often do not help a person who's in distress. We think that someone else is going to help them, so it's this diffusion of responsibility. I don't need to call the police. That other person's going to call the police. Somebody else is seeing this, they're going to call. I have no need to do that. So we just don't even bother to call. We don't bother to help. Or we just think that we don't want to get involved. So we don't want to get involved with somebody else's stuff. So this is important then, too. If you ever need to give someone CPR, you can point at somebody and say, you, call an ambulance. You shut the door. You call out somebody in particular so they can't diffuse that responsibility. You let them know, I'm putting you in charge of this task. Prosocial behavior is a really, really interesting topic. So you could spend a lot of time trying to understand, is this even a real thing? So with prosocial behavior, the idea is that you're doing it voluntarily and you want to help others. So I think we all kind of agree most of the time that prosocial behavior is a thing. Where people get confused is if these behaviors can ever be altruistic. So can we ever really help others even if it's personally harmful to the self? So this could be something related to empathy, to being selfless. It could help us as a society to survive, so it could have these evolutionary motives, or it could be self-serving in some way. But we're really kind of not sure exactly, so there's a debate as to whether or not altruism is a real thing, if we really see altruism. We definitely see prosocial behavior, but is it altruistic in nature? So when do we help other people? We know that some situations it's hard to tell if somebody needs our help, so that can be an issue. And then many times we think people run through a cost-benefit analysis. So if I help, what's going to happen here? If I don't help, what's going to happen here? So kind of thinking that through. Should I help or should I not? Relationships are something else that social psychologists study. So we form relationships. The single most important factor in forming relationships is how close we are to somebody in contact. So people have done this with studies of residence halls. You're much more likely to be friends with or to date someone who's one door down than you are someone who's 2, 3, 4 doors down. So those closest to you we're more likely to form relationships with. It's also important, though, how similar we are to people, as well as how much give and take there is. So there's these 36 questions that social psychologists have made that kind of help us to do this self-disclosure process, to kind of form these relationships. But we know that it's really important, how close we are, how alike we are, and then how much give and take there is. Attraction is also something that's super important. Physical attraction, especially this kind of facial and body symmetry, are really important factors. But we also look for those, it's called the matching hypothesis. We look for those that seem to be equal to us. So if you know that you are an attractive person, you might look for a similarly attractive partner. If you feel that society would view you as less attractive, you might look for a partner who's right there with you in that same kind of category. So the idea isn't that, it's that I would not go ask Beyonce for a date because Beyonce is incredibly more attractive than I. So I would not go ask her for a date. So it's this idea that we match who we're with here. The triangular theory of love is another explanation for relationships. So with this, we've got 3 components of love. You've got intimacy, passion, and commitment. So the best relationships then would have all 3. And you can see in this triangle that it's called consummate love if you have intimacy, passion, and commitment. If you only have one of each of these, then those are the points of the triangle. So if you only have intimacy, that's liking. If you only have passion, that's infatuation. If you only have commitment, that's empty love. And then on the sides of the triangle, you can see this if you have 2 components. So not all 3, but 2. So if you have passion and intimacy, it's romantic love. Intimacy and commitment, it's companionate love. And infatuous love is passion and commitment. So the ideal love, again, would be inside that circle, all 3 components. So trying to decide then how we form relationships, how we make relationships, a big kind of theory in this area is social exchange. And with this theory, it's the idea that we act as economists and we try to figure out what are the benefits to being with this person and what are the costs. And so we're always kind of weighing those out. And if the negatives become too much, then we might say, hey, we're not getting enough positive from you. We're just getting, we're not getting enough positive. We're way up here. This negative is so heavy. It's way down here. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of this relationship. Or if we're getting too many benefits and we're not giving enough costs, we might feel like it's too one-sided and that we're not doing our part. So we kind of act then to see how these relationships are balancing out over time. So we've been through a lot of theories in social psych. So we've gotten through things like prejudice, discrimination, attitudes, relationships, kind of many of these big major theories in social psychology. So I appreciate your time, and I'll talk with you all soon. Bye!